Hello? Hello?
Hello, Kate McNally.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
Who's this? Oh, John.
Coronial court is now in session. Please be seated.
Thanks for coming back, and you're all now the same place.
Good morning, Your Honour. Thank you.
Good morning, Your Honour. I'll announce my appearance. Paula Moreau appearing for the Brown family. Superintendent Nobbs, as per before, if you could face me to answer the questions, it'll be a little bit more streamlined. I wanted to start with the written instructions provided in the emails that are attached to your statement, the one from Acting Sergeant McCormack and Sergeant Frost. Now, was that a common approach taken in the 10 or so times that you were involved in the IRT being deployed, that there'd be those sort of snap orders sent out by email?
I can't say that all of the deployments involve that, but certainly a common approach by me in terms of a snap order, yes.
All right. Now, those emails, and particularly the snap order itself, did not indicate to the IRT members that this was a general support operation as opposed to a high-risk deployment. It should have, shouldn't it, to make that clear to them, the level of risk that you had assessed in the activity?
I'd probably have to have a look at it again, but if it's not referenced, I agree it should have been referenced.
Thank you. Now, the heading used in the emails is IRT call out, arrest of violent offender, and then his name. Terminology violent offender comes from flags that have come up in the police system in relation to Kumanjayi Walker. That's correct, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
And the purpose of those sort of flags and alerts is to warn police to be on alert or mentally prepared for the possibility of violence, correct?
Correct, yes.
Now, violent, of course, as a label, could encompass anything from a slap or a punch up into very serious weaponry being used as violence.
Correct, yes.
Now, Kumanjayi's history, prior to the Axe incident, involved one conviction for assault of police. Did you know that at the time?
I
Yes.
believe I did, yes.
Okay. And that was a kicking of the shins and a spit to the face in the Alice Springs Watch House in 2018.
I accept that that's the case, but I didn't know that, the intricacies.
Sure. And his violent history, if I can put that label on it, was by far more serious in relation to Rakisha than it was in relation to anyone else, wasn't it?
The prevailing concern for me at the time was predominantly Rakisha and her well-being, yes.
Sure, but the point of these emails is to really alert police as to risk, correct?
Correct, yes.
Would you not agree that, I think you'd agree that the risk that Kumanjayi presented to officers was of a defensive kind, that is an attempt to evade arrest through potentially an assault?
Correct, yes.
Would it not be clearer and less inflammatory to say that he may assault police to evade arrest rather than that he is a violent offender?
I'm pretty confident the order did articulate that as propensity for violence, propensity to escape, may escape, and there was some terminology within the order
Yes,
articulating
that's
that
right.
fact, yes.
That's correct. But in terms of that heading, that's the first alert to the IRT members, would you agree with me that it would be more accurate to use that terminology rather than the more inflammatory language of violent offender in the heading?
Correct, yes.
Now, there's other pieces of information that are missing from the SNAP order, and I'd like your commentary on whether it should have been included for future reference, okay? The first is the agreement that you're aware of that had been reached with Eddie and Lottie Robertson to delay the arrest until after the funeral. That should have been in the IRT SNAP order, would you agree?
I think it is in the SNAP order again. I'd have to read it again.
The funeral is mentioned, but not the agreement.
Okay, agreed.
How about we give you a copy?
I have a copy, Your Honour.
Oh, you've got one? So the next should be I've got an
You'll see, if you're looking at an extra D in the first paragraph, he's absconded primarily for the purpose of attending a family funeral in the afternoon on the 9th of the 11th, 19. You're welcome to review that, but suggesting that the agreement that had been reached is not mentioned in those emails.
Correct.
Would you agree that might have been useful for the
Certainly.
IRT members to know that there was an agreement in place for that period of time?
Certainly, yes.
And also your knowledge about the funeral being something that may have extended past the afternoon might also have been useful information for the IRT to know?
Correct, but at that time there was no information that suggested it was going to extend beyond the Saturday. In terms of the funeral that I interpret through my lens.
Yes, but and in your lens though, you're aware that it was the formal component was in the afternoon, but that could extend into some activities that evening, correct?
Correct, I acknowledge the cultural sorry business framework and obligations within that, yes.
All right. Something that would have been, should have been really in the written orders of use to the IRT.
Correct.
And finally, Kumanjayi's individual features, the fact that he had a hearing problem and some cognitive deficits. That sort of information would be critical for officers coming in to arrest him, wouldn't you agree?
Presuming that was known, yes.
Yes, that sort of information would be very relevant to officers going into an arrest
Correct.
situation.
I will, I guess, highlight though the nature of the order, and it's, as the name suggests, it's a SNAP order. It's a short, sharp, decisive set of instructions. We have, a more comprehensive order framework there. Your complete ops orders, they take a long time to craft and develop, but this was short, sharp, deliberate, recognising the multitude of other functions and obligations that Sergeant Frost and myself had at that particular time.
Sure.
So imprecise.
The longer ops orders, had you used them before for the IRT deployments you'd been involved in?
Generally speaking, an IRT deployment needs to be done now type framework, so no. Generally, if we used IRT for something like a sports carnival or a force multiplier for some other planned event, yes, and that would be inherent within the order that relates to that particular event.
All right, so in circumstances like the present, these were the only written instructions provided to IRT members, correct?
Correct, yes.
And so therefore, short and sharp, sure, but short and sharp with all relevant information for them to formulate their task.
Correct. Agree. There's always provision to include more information, and more information is always better than less.
Thank you. Now, moving to the information that you received about the situation outside the police station on the night. Now, you were primarily speaking to Sergeant Frost, correct? But you may have spoken to other officers who answered her phone when you had your 15 minutes call-ins.
Correct.
Now, you were told that there were people outside fluctuating between 20 to 200.
Correct.
Do you know on what basis those numbers were reached? Do you remember that?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Do you remember the information as to how 200, for instance, how that number was reached by the information you were given?
I'm not too sure. No, I didn't explore. I was just simply accepted the assertion that there was anywhere between 50 and 200, and whether that was a product of what they could hear and an estimation, I'm not too sure.
Okay, thank you. Now, throughout the night, there were some rocks thrown on the roof of the police station.
Correct.
But no attempts to breach the station perimeter?
Not that I was aware of, but certainly a reasonable apprehension as to the possibility of that occurring.
It was easy to do.
Correct. And
But it did not occur. There was no attempt to do it to your knowledge.
not that I was aware, yes.
And no rocks were thrown at the windows in the front of the police station.
Again, no, but a reasonable and high apprehension that that could reasonably occur.
Understood. I'm just talking about the actual facts that occurred. Now, Sergeant Frost was, of course, stressed and fatigued at this stage.
Correct.
Now, at one point, she expressed to you that she was afraid the police station would be set on fire with the police in it. You recall that?
Yes.
And you, as you pointed out to her at the time, and you told police officers in your interview, there was zero evidence or information to suggest that.
Zero evidence to suggest that the police station could be set on fire, but again, a reasonable apprehension that Sergeant Frost had, and one that I supported and shared equally, notwithstanding I wasn't UNMU at the time.
But you pointed out to her that that particular fear didn't have any basis in evidence or information at hand.
Correct.
At least in that sense, her fears were exaggerated, weren't they?
No.
And you reject the possibility that any other observations were affected by stress, fatigue, anxiety on her part.
There's no doubt her observations could have been influenced by stress, fatigue and anxiety, but her observations, and that's a matter for her, but it's my assessment of her conduct at the time is that her observations were influenced by her lived experience, and my acceptance of those observations were influenced by my lived experience in terms of the issues and the challenges within the UNMU community.
Now, I'll come to that in a moment, but have you seen the live stream videos that were taken by a member of the community from outside the police station?
I've seen snippets on the media.
I see.
Very few.
I want to play a couple of short snippets to you and get your comment in answer to the question. Exhibit 4-20, please, if it can be started at the beginning. Now, this is a live stream from 8:31 p.m. on the evening. If we can play up to about a minute for this one.
So we don't know what's happening. We got told that he's been shot and that he was bleeding, and at the house there's 3 case gun shells and a lot of blood. No one's told, we don't know about the police, no one's told us if he's alive, if he's well. Apparently, yeah, I'm recording you now. I'm recording. Yeah, we're trying to find out what's happening now. Yeah. They got guns? They got guns? Yeah. Why are they getting guns? They're getting guns and stuff. They're getting shotguns. We've just been told that he got shot twice in the shoulder, or I wasn't there, but that's what my uncle's telling me.
All right, if it can be halted there. That's a video that was posted at 8:31 p.m. that evening.
Thank you.
The next one I'm going to take you to is Exhibit 4-21, posted at 9:21, so about just under an hour later that evening. And if this can be stopped at about 30 seconds in.
Heard nothing yet. Hello, baby. Lower. Nothing. Apparently the ambulance is here, but I didn't see them. They might be getting treated. I don't know. You didn't see nothing, Mum?
All right, that could be stopped now.
Biggest more fat.
And then the final video, Exhibit 4-22, and that was posted at 10:16 p.m. So about just under an hour after that one. And again, about 30 seconds.
It's been 4 hours and we've still not heard anything. We've been asking the police to come out and just give us an update. We just want to know if he's alive, if he's well, and absolutely nothing. I'm still sitting out here waiting. Yeah, your mom, listen to Mum.
All right, that can be stopped there. Thank you, Beck. Now, appreciate that these are moments in time captured by those videos, but the circumstances depicted there, can you comment whether that is consistent or inconsistent with what you were told about the situation outside that evening?
Well, as you've alluded to, they are a very narrow moment in time, but certainly inconsistent with the notion that there was unrest, and I certainly can't say in terms of the numbers. It does look like there's a narrow pan, but it does look like there's a lot of numbers there, but those moments in time are acknowledged to be relatively calm.
Thank you. Now, you gave evidence about public safety being the primary or priority in your decision making around these critical decisions that you made at this time. And of course, I'm talking about the decisions, firstly, to evacuate the police, secondly, not to tell the family of Kumanjayi's passing, and then not to send an officer out to the crowd to engage with them, with Derek Williams. Okay, they're the critical decisions I'm focusing on at the moment. Now, effectively, when you say public safety, as you did in your evidence, you are referring really to the safety of police and police property, aren't you?
Definitely not, no.
Why not? What other safety issues were you referring to in terms
the whole
of public
community
safety?
that encompasses the police, encompasses stakeholders, encompasses those that are there peacefully, genuinely wanting to know what's going on inside the police station and the conditions of Kumanjayi Walker. It includes those that could potentially involve in unrest associated with it. My oath is to protect the community, not the police officers within the police station, but certainly recognise that the police officers are equally a priority.
Now, you're talking about impacts on the community that would be consequent upon individuals breaching the police station, aren't you?
Breaching the police station, a violent disorder, a multitude of things.
And the risk for the community is from police, isn't it? Police with police weapons responding to some sort of unrest, isn't it?
Sorry, say that again.
The risk for community members is a risk posed by police defensively in relation to any unrest around the police station, isn't it?
Arising from the conduct of the community, correct.
Yes.
Although, and there is potential collateral issues that's inherent within that though, but yes.
Now, the basis for your belief that that particularly police interests, but I accept your evidence about the broader implications and the way we've just discussed it, but the factors you referred to when you were under questions from Dr. Dwyer as to your belief that their safety was in jeopardy was the fact of the critical incident, firstly. Secondly, the information you were receiving on the ground. Thirdly, your lived experience in the NT. And fourthly, your knowledge of the Yundamu community in particular. Are they the four factors that led to your belief about safety risk?
Correct, but I guess so far within these proceedings we've explored a number of them, but we haven't necessarily explored my lived experience that underpins my perception of
I was
risk.
just about to ask you that, Superintendent. What do you mean by your lived experience within the Northern Territory informing your belief?
Well, I guess as I indicated in my my evidence in chief, that 24 years in the police service, of that 18 years within Central Australia, predominantly operations, passion for remote policing, so I generally gravitate towards remote policing, all within Central Australia.
I'm sorry, I was just hoping you could focus on the lived experience that informed your assessment of the safety risk here. I realise you have plenty of lived experience, but
brevity is not my strong point, but I'm
safety
trying to provide the context necessary to get to lived experience. But over the years, I've seen a secular increase in dysfunction and harm and crime. It continues to go up despite all of our collective best efforts to resolve those issues. At the present time, we find ourselves on a per capita basis by far the unenviable highest representation of crime in Australia by well and truly far. So in terms of manslaughter rates, we're 4 times the highest, the next highest, not the national average, but the next highest jurisdiction. We are 3.5 times the next jurisdiction for incidents involving injuries, with 3 times assaults, with 2 times unlawful entries, with 4 times public order. I've seen, unfortunately, and I'm talking about the Walker people now, a multitude of civil unrest matters. 2010, the stabbing of 2 people, the tragic death of 1, buildings burnt, cars burnt, the evacuation and the displacement of Walker people for months into South Australia. 2014, the Tea Tree riots, 200 people involved in that, again, predicated on Walker people going into a place they weren't welcome, resulting in issues there. 2018, the Alicrun riots, again, 1 dead, tragically. Houses burned, cars burnt, people displaced, 500 people involved there. So my experience as it relates to the Walker people in respect to these unrest, and each of these matters have an element of perceived injustice, a grievance, mob mentality, and results in substantial harm, damage, destruction, and people displaced. So, and each of them have elements of, there's likely to have been an articulation of an issue, but then a quickly deterioration into chaos and mob mentality rule. So I guess that's my lived experience as to how quick these things turn. And that was, I guess, what I feared at that point in time as it relates to UNAMU as well.
Now, you started off with general crime statistics being high in the Northern Territory. Of course, those sorts of crimes exist both in white communities and Aboriginal communities, correct?
Certainly, but certainly a disproportionate in terms of NT. And I guess as I just talked about how disproportionately high NT is, I haven't talked about how disproportionately high then again UNAMU is relative to that crime data. So what I've highlighted is an underrepresentation as it relates to UNAMU.
Obviously, crimes are committed, and I'll move to the riot kind of events that you've spoken about in a moment. But just speaking about general crime levels, these are individual acts of violence that you're referring to, and the statistics in relation to individual acts of violence, correct?
Individual acts of violence that sometimes have multiple participants within that instance.
But it's not common that a white community is labelled with the effects of an individual act of violence, is it? It's a different approach that's taken when you're speaking about levels of violence in Aboriginal communities.
So I don't understand the basis of that question.
If you're talking about a domestic violence, manslaughter or murder, that is an individual crime that is not then taken to reflect the community that person came from.
No,
in the white community.
No, it's not, I guess, but I operate in the remote Indigenous communities, and that's my frame of reference.
So you're approaching that differently given that experience. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm approaching it in the only way that I know how to approach it, because that's the environment in which I operate. But a strong element within the overrepresentation of particularly offences against the persons are the perceptions or the justification through the payback lens. So that's the frame of reference in which I have based on where I operate.
Now, In terms of the riots, you use the term riot. You use that when there's, more than 100 people involved, like a fairly large-scale activity?
I guess there's no hard and fast definition.
But the way you use it is
Okay.
a large-scale activity?
Correct. A civil unrest, the participants exceed, the police capacity to respond. There's a common purpose. There's a large-scale destruction and injury.
And I don't want to go into the details of all of those events, but were there any that were triggered by police conduct?
No, not...
You mentioned 2010, 2014 and 2018.
I think the 2014, the tea tree one, there may have been some potential elements of some questions that police potentially, by some participants, may have re-inflamed the situation by filming.
But generally, you're talking about intra-Aboriginal group
Correct.
Unrest and riot and burning and violence in
Correct.
that context.
So the aggrieved
correct?
party have a view that the transgressor is a rival Indigenous clan or community.
So, and that relates to all three of those ones that you specifically
Correct,
mentioned.
yes.
You mentioned in your evidence that you were concerned that culturally there might be an attempted retribution towards police. Is that your view?
Correct, yes.
Are you referring to a concept of payback, are you?
Correct, yes.
That concept as a cultural concept is necessarily one that is limited to the Aboriginal community, not relations between Aboriginal members and
Disagree
white.
strongly in that regard. Again, my lived experience is quite substantial in terms of witnessing payback, and I've seen payback quite powerfully undertaken, but I see that very rarely. I could see that, I guess, on one hand in terms of instances where payback is about payback's about resolving a grievance. It's about bringing domestic discipline and finalisation of a grievance within a community. I've seen it very powerfully in some communities, but by and large I've seen the substantial corruption of payback through payback for payback for payback,
But we're speaking
consumption of liquor, weapons made and adapted, baseball bats with barbed wire. Each of these rights that I talk about have the justification in the minds of the participants that this is a necessary requirement for payback purposes.
But again, we're talking about community against community, aren't we? Aboriginal community.
We are talking about a focus on a transgressor. That's what we're talking about.
But your experience is within the Aboriginal community itself.
We are, but again, the transgressor in most cases is another Indigenous person.
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily say. So if I talk about a 2015 matter at another community, and I won't say the community other than to say it was within here, the police see some liquor, the offender in relation to that matter drives his vehicle through the police station front door to inflict payback because of the issues around the seizure of liquor. I've got multiple cases where police are told, a fatality in 2019 in another remote community where police had to be taken out of that community through threats to kill and the necessity to provide payback. So it's about the transgressor, it's not about the individual. I acknowledge there's an overrepresentation of the transgressor being another Indigenous person, but it's not limited to that, particularly when I talk about that, broadly speaking, payback is corrupted too frequently.
But the instances you just mentioned then were again individuals enacting some sort of revenge.
They're cultural people talking about payback.
But individuals, not necessarily the entire community acting in that way.
Well, the fatality in that community was large-scale community members attending the police station, indicating that they needed to provide payback to the police officers involved in the fatal motor vehicle accident. So that was extended.
That's in a different community to Yundamoo?
Correct, but it's in a community within Central Australia.
I see. And was there actually payback affected?
No, it's again a de-escalation, a plan put in place, engagement, consultation, various days to de-escalate the situation and take the passion out of the situation and then respond to it accordingly.
Are you aware of any data or research available to you as the IMT leader responding to this critical incident, how to effectively engage with a community like Yuendumu in that sequelae?
Data, sorry?
Data, research, training about how to engage with the community post a critical incident like this?
Well, look, there's no script. Clearly, I don't think you could write a script, but most cases, it's we build
Operational experience. Okay. Now, the ruse that you set up with Sergeant Frost, did it extend to your knowledge to persons at the Alice Springs Hospital being told to answer community calls to the effect that he was being brought there?
No, not that I'm aware of, no. And I think I would have been aware of it, so the answer is no.
Now, you knew, obviously, Eddie Robertson before this evening quite well.
Correct, yes.
You also knew Kumanjayi Nelson, who's sadly passed since, and you knew other elders from Yuendumu community at the time.
Yes.
An alternative way to responding to the crowd outside of the police station, I'm suggesting to you, is one of engaging with elders and engaging with family. That is an alternative, isn't it?
It's certainly not an alternative, but it wasn't a safe alternative on the night, and it's an alternative that, whilst I considered, I didn't enact due to safety concerns.
You made the conscious decision not to engage with elders, correct? Yes.
Very conscious, yes.
And also not to encourage or order Sergeant Frost to do so.
Correct.
Now, by 11:50 p.m, Eddie Robertson contacts police. The notes from your scribe indicate that the communication that came from Forward Commander Zhang to mislead and lie, in fact, to Mr. Robertson came from you?
Yes,
that direction?
Certainly something that wasn't comfortable with, not comfortable for Senior Sergeant Zhang, certainly not comfortable as it relates to the community, something that I acknowledge has caused considerable harm and distress and hurt, but a very conscious decision nonetheless, yes.
And of course, we're talking about a time at almost approaching midnight on this evening that phone call was made.
Yes.
I think it's noted in the notes that it's calm at the station at that point. Yes. There had been no breach of the station perimeter or attacks on the station at that point.
Correct, and I maintain that reality was a product of two things, and two things only at the time, and they were...
How can you say that from where you were sitting? Sorry, I'll let you finish your answer first.
Well, firstly, they were the two things, and that was the involvement of Derek Williams and the other elders at the front of the police station, and then the second one was the deliberate and calculated deception, the so-called ruse, were the two factors that, in my mind, did not result in a catastrophic outcome. And I think it's quite clear that whilst there was an immediate escalation around the conveyance from the airstrip, the evidence will show, well, it's quite clear to me from my recollection within the IMT, that there was a fairly substantial and quick, rapid abatement of issues, in my mind, predicated on the basis that there was a broad belief and understanding that Kumanjayi Walker was still being treated in a condition and being transferred to Alice Springs. So those are the two factors in my mind that changed the dynamics.
Thank you. That's your personal view. That's not been the result of any risk assessment post-event or anything of a formal kind.
No.
It's a personal view based on experience.
Yes.
It's the personal view that informed my organic and ongoing risk assessment.
And as you say, you thought things had abated somewhat because of the ruse, correct?
And coupled with the leadership demonstrated by Derek Williams and the elders.
All right. Obviously, the leadership demonstrated by Derek Williams and the elders is something that I've put to you could have been used to greater effect by proactive engagement by police with them.
I acknowledge your question. I disagree.
Now, I think, in your earlier evidence spoke about the cultural sensitivities around these issues of telling family about the passing of their loved one or permitting family to see him before he passed. But I think you've just said, it's not just that. It's really plain old humanity, isn't it?
Yes.
And these decisions caused anger and offence, but also personal distress and psychological harm to members of his family.
Cause and acknowledge that still probably causing, not a doubt in my mind, something that doesn't sit comfortably with me. As I said in my evidence in chief, I'm a different police officer because of this night, but I still maintain in my position, based on my experience, necessary at the time.
And harm you're referring to not just for his family, but also the broader community that were there that evening.
Correct. The byproduct is the harm, erosion of trust, something that's going to probably put us back a substantial way. But again, I say well-intended on my part, to try to keep a community that I care about safe.
My final question. Would you concede the reasonable possibility that at least by midnight, when Mr. Robertson makes that phone call, that he could have and indeed should have been told the truth?
No. My position from the moment was that until I established sufficient capability within community and the arrival of the TRG at 1:30 a.m, and not only the arrival, but then we had opportunity to robustly develop a communication strategy, and that was considered, and there was a risk overlay around that communication strategy, that the communication wasn't appropriate, based on my fear that the dynamics could change within the community at a moment. And the ruse, as uncomfortable as it is, was what, in my mind, had resulted in the abatement of the community within the police station.
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. Superintendent, my name is O'Neill. I appear for the Walker, Lane and Robertson families.
Good morning.
I want to take you to some evidence that you gave last time you were before the court on the 27th of September. I might just have that brought up, transcript pages 1096 to 1097. Sorry, Beck.
While we're waiting for that, no one has been interested in this idea, but I'm going to float it again with you, Superintendent, to see if you think there's any meaning to it. Whether when you're putting together your teams in Darwin and Alice Springs, there should have been a trained negotiator or communicator as part of those teams to perhaps, I'm not saying what they would have said to anybody and whether they would have, whether there would have been just any decision other than, let's call it the ruse. But do you think it would have been helpful for someone to have been communicating with the family in a strategic way rather than simply effectively keeping them at bay?
It's a hard question to answer, Your Honour. I recall reflecting back on my engagement with Sergeant Frost and Senior Sergeant Zeng, and whilst it probably wasn't helpful to them, I remember trying to convey the need to avoid the conversation, to avoid the inevitable lie that would fall out of that conversation. My position was quite firm in terms of when we will engage, and whether that was a negotiator or the members at the time, I wanted to limit the interaction based on what Derek was telling us, based on my understanding of the risk, because I didn't want to lie. I knew we had to lie, but I don't know. I don't think I've answered your question, Your Honour, but...
Do you think if inevitably someone was going to have to do that, it might have been better if it was someone specifically trained in negotiation/communication and managing information? Would that have assisted? And two, would it have been fairer on the members if it was someone who had those specific skills and removed from the personal engagements that those people had?
100%, Your Honour. Our negotiators are exceptional. They're trained. So, yes, at the very least, they should have been put on standby as yet another specialist support capability that would assist, and they could have assisted in that regard. So, yes.
And when the communication actually occurred, we've seen difficulties around that. For example, the wrong name was used. There wasn't actually, whilst there was, we've been told by Sergeant Zhang, there was a plan in relation to sort of safety and timing and that it would be light and who would be there and a car 100 metres away and things like that. There was a good planning about who would actually deliver the message and what words would be used.
So not only was the plan, or the absence of a plan, I guess, it was the absence of the structure. So the NTEX, as we were going through at the time, or the ICCS plus structure, so the instant control structure has, your 10 functional elements within that structure, and one of those is around public information and communication. The notion that Sergeant Zheng had to be all to everyone is not necessarily the case. What there should have been within the structure was a span of control and an allocation of a particular role to the people. So it could have been, Sergeant Frost, you're my public information and communication officer. Go away and develop a robust communication plan. What that looks like, what is the script, what is our if-then considerations around, if we're asked this question, what are we going to say then? If we're asked this question, what are we saying then? It doesn't necessarily fall on the forward commander. In fact, it probably shouldn't fall on the forward commander to undertake that function. It could have, but not necessarily the case, given he's the senior person there. So it's the structure that they didn't have in place.
So, I mean, for example, so someone on the ground would actually deliver the message, but someone with those skills would be assisting in the development and the scripting.
Correct. And it would have potentially been better delivered by someone that had respect, connection, mutual respect, connection, relationship. So, and then you wouldn't have the embarrassing situation where you call someone the wrong name. It's that's.
Right, so I just want you to think about whether or not there should be a negotiator or communicator on that kind of team.
Agreed.
Behind the scenes. Sorry.
Not at all, Your Honour. Superintendent, I think you should have now there in front of you page 1096 of the transcript.
Yes, thank you.
If I can just take you right to the bottom of that page, the last question. It starts in terms of what you were being told there. Just refresh your memory by reading that and over the page to the end of the third question.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So, Superintendent, my impression of what you've said there is that common sense and cultural sensitivity might dictate the delay of an arrest, but under the strict terms of police powers, such an arrest cannot be delayed. Is that correct?
So not just police powers, statutory provision. So correct, yes.
So I just want to take you to that, if I may. The first provision, which is section 38.2 of the Arrest General Order, that's at 17.5 of Your Honour's brief. It says this, and if Beck has it there, I might get it brought up. Bear with me.
Seventeen.
38.2, Your Honour. So 38.2, you can see that there, Superintendent?
Yes, thank you.
It says members should be mindful that the arrest warrant directs members of the police force to arrest and bring the person before the court to answer to the information and to be further dealt with according to law. Do you see that?
Correct, yes.
The provision to delay taking the person before the court afforded by section 137.2 of the Police Administration Act is not available in these circumstances. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, 137.2 of the Police Administration Act relates to when police are permitted to detain a person after arrest, before taking them to court for the purpose of interview and investigation, that kind of thing.
Correct, yes.
So this section 38.2 does not limit a police officer's discretion in relation to an arrest before they are arrested. Do you agree with that? And just so you're aware of where I'm going with this, Superintendent, I'm going to take you to another provision in relation to the general order regarding warrants. Perhaps we'll go there now so that you have all the information.
Thank you.
This is Exhibit 9 in the inquest at 9.1. So you see there at 9.1 it states, a member must not withhold execution of any warrant because of personal consideration for a defendant. Do you see that?
Correct, yes.
And so going back to the one I showed you before, 38.2, it doesn't relate to delay before an arrest. 9.1 is the provision that speaks of delay before an arrest pursuant to a warrant. Do you agree with that?
Except that's what it says, yes.
And 9.1 there speaks of not withholding execution of a warrant because of personal consideration for a defendant, correct?
Correct, yes.
Now, police regularly make decisions about the most appropriate time to arrest someone, correct?
Correct, yes.
Including where you're arresting somebody pursuant to a warrant, correct?
Correct, yes.
In making those decisions, the execution of the warrant may be withheld because of considerations such as the safety of police.
Correct, yes.
The efficient allocation of resources.
Yes.
The interests of the broader community.
Yes.
For example, police sometimes wait until the circuit court comes to community before arresting people on warrants within that community so that they can be dealt with on the day of court.
Maybe.
Another example is delaying a non-urgent arrest to take into account cultural matters such as sorry business.
Arrest or a warrant?
Well,
execution of a warrant?
Arrest pursuant to a warrant, yes.
And that's clearly what we've done in this case here. It's whilst the explicit instruction within the general order says you won't, we did.
Well, I'd suggest sorry business is not simply personal consideration for a defendant. It also includes respect for a community, and it assists police to ensure a peaceful arrest.
Agreed, but I don't think the absence of those terms in there denote that we should be allowed to, for considerations of the community, but equally acknowledge that we do daily around safety, all the factors you've outlined, yes.
I'd suggest to you that the decision you made to delay the arrest of Kumanjayi Walker until after the funeral was quite a proper exercise of police discretion in relation to your powers in respect of arrest. Do you agree with that?
Agreed, it was appropriate and necessary in the circumstances based on cultural sensitivities, but I don't accept that it was supported by the framework, the rigid framework in which we operate in.
Do you think it would assist police if this was clarified in the arrest or warrant general order?
Certainly it would. It's influenced again by the statutory provisions also.
Well, there's nothing in the statute that speaks about the timing of an arrest. Can you take that from me?
If you say so. I thought 42 and 43 of the Sentencing Act could be interpreted as such, but if you say it doesn't, I accept that.
I'll come back to that. But I suggest to you that the Police Administration Act certainly does not include anything in it to suggest anything that police have to take into account in terms of determining when to arrest a person.
Agreed, that's not in the Police Administration Act, yes.
Do you think it would also assist to list matters that a police officer might take into account in determining when to effect an arrest?
Yes, certainly.
And that could occur either within the legislation or within the general orders?
Probably not in the legislation, but certainly within the general orders. Anything that gives a police officer a ready reckoner or an aide memoire or an assistance in decision making is beneficial, yes.
And those matters would include the timing of any cultural events within a community?
Most certainly.
I'll just move to a... Sorry, I might have... I've just had the opportunity to look at sections 42 and 43. My understanding of those sections is that they relate to the circumstances in which a police officer may arrest for breach of a suspended sentence, either with or without a warrant. I can't locate anything in those sections that deal with the timing of the execution of a warrant or arrest in accordance with those sections. Is it your understanding that there is something in there?
It's been a while since I've read it. I thought it, whether explicitly directed or reasonably inferred that there's no delay provision within that. I could be wrong. It's been a long time since I've read it, but...
I'll move to another topic, if I may, Superintendent.
Thank you. I guess the only thing I'll say on the last topic, though, is acknowledging the cultural sensitivities. The balance I applied, as I indicated in my evidence in chief, was the safety of Rakesha. So I put an arbitrary line in the sand as to what I was willing to accept, and I wasn't willing to accept the ongoing situation that saw Kumanjayi Walker at large. Notwithstanding, I accepted that there would be a continuation of cultural matters post the funeral proper.
You had no power to arrest Kumanjayi Walker, though, in relation to anything that had occurred in relation to Rakesha, correct?
No, but that was my primary concern.
If he had completed his term at Kapu and been released into the community, as was relatively imminent, there'd be no basis to arrest him in relation to any concern in respect of Rakisha, correct?
And I'm not talking about an arrest, but an arrest would facilitate a mitigation of risk to Rakisha at that given time.
The most recent incident in relation to Rakisha was 12 months before November 2019.
So in terms of Rakisha, so as I indicated my evidence in chief, I was the chair of the Yunamu Family Safety Framework. Kumanjayi Walker and Rakisha were probably one of the most challenging participants within that framework. I had a really good understanding of some of the complexities of their relationship. So from 2016 to 2019, I think there had been 6 assaults on Rakisha.
Yes, but Superintendent, the most recent assault before November 2019 was 12 months prior. Do you agree with that?
Yes, but I also acknowledge within the family safety framework the broad perception or acceptance that there was a substantial underreporting by Rakisha as a very vulnerable and difficult victim. So that's where my fear predominantly was in terms of risk to Rakisha going forward.
And is there understood to be a greater risk, as I understand it, when someone is released back into the community after a period?
That's the most critical time, Your Honour. What we generally have the benefit of within the family safety framework is having an appreciation as to a release date and then putting the mitigations in place to reduce the risk. Kumanjayi Walker's absconding didn't allow us to put the mitigations in place, and the mitigations were challenging at the best of times with Rakisha. So I had a real fear around Rakisha, and equally with my organic risk assessment, whilst I was aware of the cultural sensitivities, I also have in the back of my mind constantly, it's quite possible I'd be sitting in this very court explaining why being asked the question, Superintendent Nobbs, but you didn't have discretion, yet you allowed a known repeat domestic violence offender to be at large when you didn't have a safety plan in place for a known repeat domestic violence victim. So it's a balance, and I drew an arbitrary line in the sand, and that was the reasoning behind it.
Superintendent, you spoke about substantial underreporting. To your knowledge, there'd been no reporting by Rakisha, as at November 2019, of any acts of violence towards her since Kumanjayi Walker's absconsion from Kapu, correct?
Correct, yes.
And indeed, you were aware that on the 6th of November, she was in the company of Kumanjayi Walker, correct?
Which was always the case, yes.
And you were aware that her actions on the 6th of November were more consistent with her being protective of Kumanjayi, correct?
Correct, yes.
And so this idea that you were somehow concerned for harm to Rakisha in those circumstances was speculative at best, correct?
Well, domestic violence is very insidious. There's a multitude of factors. So the notion that Rakisha was in company with Kumanjayi Walker, therefore she was safe and not in any risk, I think is not appropriate.
She hadn't asked for an AVO, had she?
She had, so in her, from 2016 to 2019, there was 3 in place. So one...
I'm not asking you about that period of time.
I'm interested though.
I beg your honest pardon.
No, you've raised an issue and I would like to understand it.
Quite.
So there's 3 in place. So one in 2016, that was a no harm order that I think went through its 12 months duration or time frame. Then in 2017, there was another one that lasted no more than 3 months. That was an application, I think, brought about by police for a no contact whilst intoxicated order, but that was ultimately withdrawn in court, I think, at the insistence of Rakisha and family, I suspect. And then there was another one that was the subject of an ongoing application at the time of Kumanjayi's passing that obviously didn't And that's my memory of the three that we had. So I think there was a live matter at the time.
But it wasn't at Rakisha's insistence, was it?
None of them were at Rakisha's assistance. They were brought about recognising the vulnerability of Rakisha. There was a multitude of things that we tried to do, paying for her and family to go to Adelaide, which it was challenging.
Just to be clear, my clients aren't suggesting that that wasn't a fair consideration. But in terms of the arrest of Kumanjayi Walker in November 2019, your arrest powers had nothing to do with the safety of Rakisha, did they?
No, but the arbitrary line in the sand I drew was influenced by Rakisha.
And in fact, it's possible, isn't it, that had Kumanjayi been peacefully arrested, that he could have applied for bail, correct?
Most certainly, yes. And that happens all the time, where applications are put to a magistrate around cultural matters, and it's not uncommon for the courts to say, acknowledge the cultural significance, bail denied.
But the other is true as well.
Correct, yes.
I'll move now, if I may, to another topic. The inquest has received evidence that Julie Frost sent Derek Williams a text on the afternoon of the 9th of November, about 2 p.m, indicating, "Hey Derek, getting IRT out here tonight. Can you give me a quick buzz at some stage before or after funeral so I can put a plan in action?" That's at Annexure JF4. Were you aware of that text?
No.
After a decision was made to deploy the IRT, did you discuss with Sergeant Frost that she should inform Derek or the elders in the Yundamu community, somebody like Eddie Robertson, of the deployment of the IRT?
Sorry, can you ask that question again? I apologise.
No, of course. After a decision was made to deploy the IRT, did you discuss with Sergeant Frost that she should inform Derek or the elders of the Yundamu community of the deployment of the IRT?
No.
In his statement, Derek says that he received the text, but that he did not know what the IRT was. Does that surprise you?
No.
He also stated that even after discussing it with Sergeant Frost, he didn't know Sergeant Frost was bringing in people who were going to be all kitted up with heavy stuff. Does that surprise you?
Yes.
And is that because you would have expected, if Sergeant Frost spoke with Derek about it, that she would give him a sense of what the IRT was going to look like in the Yundamu community?
Yes, for one, and two, that notwithstanding Derek was a senior Aboriginal community police officer operating within Yundamu, my understanding, or certainly expectation, would be that whilst he may not know what the abbreviation IRT stands for, that he would have an appreciation of what a surge deployment into a location looks like, because it occurs with regularity.
Were you aware before now that Derek did not have an understanding as of the afternoon of the 9th of November about what an IRT would look like in the Yundamu community?
If you're saying I accept that, yes.
Well, I'm not really asking you to accept a proposition that I'm putting to you. I'm asking you whether you have been aware before today that Derek did not understand what an IRT was going to look like in the Yundamu community.
No knowledge of this until you ask me the questions now.
Do you accept that having unknown police in the community conducting high visibility patrols during sorry business would have been something that would be concerning to the Yundamu community?
No, not at all.
What about if they were armed with long arm rifles?
Certainly, yes. The high visibility deployment is, there's a multitude of options within that. It's driving around the community, it's go to the basketball court and play basketball with the kids. It's a whole multitude of things. It's the notion that it's an overt punitive expectation is not the case. The high visibility is provide some reassurance to the community that the concerns they've got around break and enters and things such as that is we've got some plans in place to protect to respond to that.
But you've seen the videos now of what occurred.
Correct. Yes. I've seen snippets of what I've been provided within these proceedings. I don't know if I've seen them all.
And the footage that was depicted in those videos wasn't of police officers going into the Yuendamu community, playing basketball and providing reassurance, correct?
And I've indicated already that I don't accept how and why that occurred.
But if that's what was contemplated, in your words, an overt punitive approach, if that's what was contemplated, you would expect the community to be consulted, correct?
No. If we got to the stage that we had to provide some sort of high tactical action with the elements inherent within a tactical action, no, we wouldn't communicate with the community in that regard. That would generally be a stealth situation or some elements of, no.
So in neither situation, not in your situation where you contemplated a high visibility patrol, nor in the situation that we saw in the videos, in neither situation would you consult with the Yuendamu community about the deployment of those officers, correct?
No. I accept you potentially could in the first situation, but I don't think it's completely necessary.
You gave some evidence on the last occasion about the importance of connectedness and communication with Aboriginal communities. Do you recall giving that evidence?
Yes.
This is at 1082 to 1083 of the transcript. You spoke there about the importance of local decision-making in community buy-in because that's where the answers are, you said.
Agreed.
You spoke about decision-making being local and that Aboriginal people should be empowered to make these decisions about their own communities.
Agreed.
And did you hold those views in November 2019?
I've always I won't say always held those views, but certainly have held those views for a very, very long time in terms of the importance of communities in any decision making and as the genuine need to resolve some of the particular challenges within Indigenous communities.
And yet when the issues of additional unknown police in the community during sorry business arose, you say that it's perfectly fine not to discuss that with the local community.
I'm certainly not saying it's fine. I said to you, I accept that we could have. To me, it was a situation where we had a couple of additional the intent was a couple of additional police vehicles driving around the community, interacting with the community, trying to build about some reassurance. So, there was cultural matters going on at the time. The notion that we would go and say, hey, just to let you know, we're going to have some additional police coming in. I don't know whether it was particularly necessary, but it could have occurred.
I mean, in terms of getting local buy-in and that being where the answers are, if police are regularly undertaking those kinds of communications with the community, that's going to build trust, isn't it?
Agreed, yes.
And it is going to be something that leads to community buy-in. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
In your interview with investigators on the 29th of November 2019, you told them that you viewed the community as challenging, correct?
Agreed, yes.
As lacking in resilience, correct?
As a broad proposition, yes, I agree. I said that. I don't know whether that was a fair characterisation, but certainly said at the time and agree that some elements of the community lack resilience, yes.
Well, it's not a fair characterisation, is it?
Sorry?
It's not a fair characterisation.
Not if you're talking about the community in totality, no.
You also described the community as pretty pathetic. Do you remember saying that?
No, that's... acknowledge that I was going to get that question. I didn't say pathetic. I note that it says within the transcript pathetic. What I said was apathy, and I invite you to listen to the audio if necessary.
So you described the community as apathetic, is that right?
Apathetic, correct, yes. And again, probably not a fair characterisation of a community that I know is powerful and a community that I have a good relationship with. But in the construct of a many hour interview, that was the term I used at the time. It's probably not a fair characterisation of the community in totality, but it was apathetic, not apathetic community. There was an error.
Regardless of whether it was pathetic or apathetic.
No, I object, Your Honour. It is apathetic, is in my respectful submission, and we will fix the transcript, and I accept that that's our error. I should have ensured that that transcript was fixed beforehand because there's a significant difference. So I apologise to my friend, but I'll take that on board.
What page of the transcript?
I'm just finding that now, Your Honour.
Your Honour, it's on page 51 of the interview. I just want to get some clarity, though, around the word apathetic, if I may. By that you mean not caring, don't you?
Yes, that's the term I used at the time, yes.
And it's not fair, is it, to suggest that the Yundamu community doesn't care?
Holus bolus, no, it's not fair at all. And now that that's on the record, that doesn't reflect my attitudes towards the Yunamu community in totality. And if there's any distress or upset caused by that comment, I sincerely apologise. It wasn't my intention, but to label the community more broadly, but certainly acknowledge that there's still, as in any community, some broad-based apathy in a challenging community, yes.
And we're speaking there in any community, including any non-Indigenous community.
Agreed.
You agree with that, don't
yes.
you? Now, do you regret making those comments about the Yundamu community?
I regret not providing greater context to those comments, and I regret that they could reasonably be perceived as reflective or indicative of my attitudes towards the whole community, and that's clearly not the case. So short answer is yes.
Did you understand your view? Sorry. Did you hold a view as at the 9th of November 2019 that this community was challenging, lacking in resilience and apathetic?
I held the view, and I still hold the view today, that it's a challenging community. Many challenges within that community. I held at the time and still hold today that there are some resilience challenges there, and I say that the characterisation that it's an apathetic community is probably unjust and certainly not warranted. I didn't hold the view at the time, notwithstanding that's what I said, but challenging, certainly, and resilience, certainly.
And is it possible your failure to consult with the Yundamu community or to direct the consultation with the Yundamu community on the 9th of November in relation to the deployment of the IRT was informed by those particular views that you held about it?
I'd say no.
When you made the decision to deploy the IRT, you were off duty, correct?
Correct, yes.
And you weren't in front of a computer, you didn't have a notebook, those kinds of things that you usually would have if you were on duty, correct?
Correct, yes.
And so when we speak with you and ask you questions about things that could be included in emails, other tasks that could have been undertaken, like consulting with the community, in part, are those failures, and I don't use that word suggesting they're personal failures, but things that could have been done better, are they in part due to the fact that these decisions were being made by an off-duty police officer?
Fair question. Had I been at work, would have I been more in the game? I don't, sorry, actually I withdraw that. Not referring to this as a game, it's far from, and I apologise for that statement, but had I had my mind more in what was required, I don't know, I don't think so. I think I'm professional enough and I've got experience enough that irrespective of where I'm at, I recognise the risk, I recognise the challenges, and I make sure that I, as best I can, mitigate those risks and challenges by putting a robust plan in place. So I'd say no, but I think it's a very fair question.
Superintendent, while we're on that topic, I just want to take you back to Annexure D to your statement, which is the email from Sergeant Frost setting out the operation order. And I know my colleague, Ms Moreau, has taken you to that already. You, in response to some questions by her, you said this was a snap order.
Correct, yes.
That it was short and sharp, but you accepted more information would always be better. Now, this email to you was sent at 4:49 p.m, correct?
Correct, yes.
At that point in time, were you aware that the IRT team were driving from Alice Springs to Yuendamu?
I didn't know. Reasonably assumed they would have been, yes. Whether they were in transit or there, I'm pretty confident at the time I would have expected that they were still in transit, yes.
And you know the distance from Alice Springs to Yuendamu?
Correct, yeah. I've driven it many times.
It's a number of hours, correct?
Correct, yes.
And so the IRT, the dog handler arrives at 5:30, do you recall that?
Yes.
2 members arrive at about 6:30?
I accept that's the case.
And 2 other members arrive just before 7 p.m,
yes.
Correct? So this email, at the time it was sent, 4:49 p.m, you've got at least 40 minutes before the dog handler arrives, correct?
Yes.
An hour and 40 minutes before the next 2 IRT members arrive.
I don't know the exact times, but if you say I accept that this is the case, yes.
And over 2 hours before everyone's assembled there, correct?
Correct, yes.
And in your mind, this team was being deployed at 11 p.m. that night, correct?
Correct, yes.
So I understand that you didn't have days to deal with this order, but you did have a number of hours. Do you agree with that?
The order is a guide. It's nothing more than that. The expectation is that the order, as in the intrinsic aspects of the order, are defined and redefined when the police officers are there, and then they engage in a more robust risk appreciation, conversation, briefings, if-then thinking, contingency planning. That's when the order is a template. It's to provide some sort of broad structure to articulate what's referred to as the commander's intent. This is my intent. You go away and build the nuance within the plan. So
but your
it wouldn't be my expectation that all the contingencies and elements would be noted within the plan itself, the snap order. I'd prefer them to spend time developing the actions on rather than spending the time tied to the computer effectively appeasing me in terms of the plan, if that makes sense.
You speak about it being a template, a broad structure. Would it assist police in these circumstances if there was, in fact, a template?
Certainly it would. It's and for the record, we didn't have a template. It's something that I won't say I've developed a snap order, but it's something that's not regularly used. My position at the time, and it remains my position today, that this was a routine matter. We don't respond to routine matters developing snap orders, but what we do is respond to matters developing action on and if-then thinking plans, generally articulated and verbalised within the responding teams to ensure that we're responding to these situations safely. So we have to be very careful to arbitrarily say that if we respond to a certain set of circumstances that this is the plan and needs to be documented in such a fashion, because then it starts to constrain police's capacity to respond swiftly and decisively to incidents that may or may not occur.
But in terms of this email being an expression of your intent included the IRT conducting high visibility patrols, correct?
Correct.
And that's not in the email, is it?
Yes, certainly is. It's pretty certain it is.
Page 2.
So it's plan, so page 2, plan day 1, Saturday 9th.
I beg your pardon.
Sorry.
It also, the order does refer to a 5 a.m. arrest, correct?
Correct, yes.
And your intent was that that occur for the purpose of mitigating risk of harm, correct?
Certainly, as a tried and tested framework that we use weekly, or I won't say daily, but very frequently.
But the email doesn't speak about the reason for the 5 a.m. arrest, does it?
Well, no, it doesn't, but again, it's implied by me as commonly accepted across the police service as to the factors that would necessitate such an action.
So you would have expected that anyone reading this email and learning of a 5 a.m. arrest plan would have understood that that was for the purpose of mitigating risk of harm.
Correct. And then the nuances inherent within that commander's instruction would be developed by the teams on the ground preparatory to that action taking place. So what does containment look like? What does cordon look like? Who goes where? Who's going to knock on the door? What's the conversations? What do we do if this occurs? What do we do if that occurs? They're the sort of robust nuance that's applied to the plan within the team environment to ensure that it's done safely and effectively.
This email does refer to the funeral. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And that's on the first page of the email. Do you see that?
Noted, yes.
But do you accept from me that the email doesn't refer to not attempting to arrest Kumanjayi Walker during the funeral?
Yeah, agreed. But again, it's I provided explicit instructions to that effect.
But in terms of this being a guide as an expression of the commander's intent, wouldn't it have been prudent to include that in this email?
Agreed. There's so much more that could have been in that, but it's a rabbit hole. How far you go down? There's so much more that could have been included, but you've got to balance the administrative burden versus the practicalities of developing the actual plan within the construct of the team environment.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Is that a convenient time to take the morning tea, Gina? Yes, it is. Where would you
Well, that's kind of what I said temporarily adjourned. All stand. Please be seated.
Mr. Bolton.
Thank you, Your Honour. Superintendent, when you gave evidence last time, you gave a good sketch of your involvement in the community and the establishment and the operation of the Yuendamu Community Safety Framework. And you'll remember talking about the degree to which you're able to succeed in engaging the community in the framework.
There are two frameworks, Mr. Bolton. I was wondering, one was the family safety framework, and there was a second, more general framework.
Yes, Your Honour. So the family safety framework was a framework that had been in place for a long time prior, but the Yuendamu Community Safety Committee framework was developed in March of that year as a, for lack of a better term, an apparatus to deal with a crisis situation arising from the rapid influx of property crime within the community.
And that's the one that you established.
Correct, Your Honour.
And then there was another meeting that was more.
Many other meetings, Your Honour, but the
One other that.
Community Safety Action Plan framework, the Local Authority framework,
The Community Safety Action
plans.
Plan framework was the other one that I think you talked about. I think, Mr. Bolton, I was just checking so I knew what you were talking about. I think you were talking about the Community Safety Committee framework.
The Yuendamu Community Safety Committee framework was what I was referring to, but Your Honour has cut to the chase about what I wanted to ask about, and your evidence last time about the over-proliferation of frameworks and the problems that caused. The bottom line is too many people coming from other places into the community trying to do good and it not working.
Well intended, but constrained by bureaucracy and agencies trying to assert dominance within the space. Probably not a fair characterisation, but that's the only way I could think of it at this point in time. But yes.
Trying to demonstrate that they're earning the taxpayer dollars that are being spent on it, right?
I won't provide a response to that,
but that's the problem, isn't it?
It's certainly a problem. I struggled as a player within that space to reconcile where they all fit together. There's a lack of opportunity for any framework to mature before the next crisis framework comes in, and all of them, again, well intended, are predicated on the necessity to have local decision-making methodologies underpin it, but each of them generally fail for the same reason, and that's a lack of buy-in at a community level.
So lack of buy-in, let's call that not enough local community members doing enough, right?
Well, perhaps not doing enough, but perhaps not understanding it, perhaps not having an appreciation.
Or not being given the job.
Perhaps, yes, agree.
And to do that would involve a very big change in attitude by multiple agencies, right?
Correct. I can't speak for all agencies, but I'm pretty confident I could say all agencies have the same view that of the importance for local decision making as part of an integrated interagency framework.
So that to be successful in establishing any such framework, it would need, wouldn't it, to trust Warlpiri people in Yuendamu with the decision-making power.
Correct, yes.
Was there any such trust in Yuendamu in the years leading up to this incident, do you think, really?
I'm not sure if you could draw that as a reasonable conclusion. I can't answer that question. I acknowledge that there was an absence of engagement. I don't know if that was a product of lack of trust or a lack of a multitude of other factors that that influenced that as an outcome.
Giving them the dollars to spend on themselves is part of it to succeed, isn't it?
Please provide context.
Funding Warlpiri individuals and Warlpiri community to make decisions is an essential pathway to success in any such framework, I suggest.
Yes, certainly. Any framework has to have sufficient governance, it has to have sufficient funding and support, or it won't be an enduring framework. It will be a flash in the pan. It's, as I indicated, the local authority framework, from my understanding, does have a reasonable community representation. It's because community members are remunerated accordingly for their value and input.
I just checked, the local authority that you're talking about is the Central Desert Regional Council. Is that what you're talking about, or is it something else?
Well, there's local authority across the whole of the territory, regulated by local government. So, in the case of Yuendamu, it's the Central Desert Regional Council.
That's what you were talking about when you gave evidence here last time about the one place where Warlpiri people come and engage and seem to have a say. Correct. We're talking about the Central Desert Regional Council.
In the case of Yuendamu, yes,
that's
and that's the one location that I've tried to get a foot in the door with without success. I am invited to that from time to time to answer questions that are pressing around community safety, but generally that results in a lag because it might be raised at a meeting and then I don't attend until 2 months later under invitation, and then either the issue is resolved itself or is festered or whatever. So I've tried to get a foot in the door as a recurring to discuss community safety matters as at the start of any agenda, and I've never been successful in that endeavour.
Superintendent, that council has responsibility for a range of infrastructure issues, roads, drains.
General municipal matters, but it's not constrained to that. I don't know, I don't go to the meetings, but that's their mandate.
And they're elected by the community?
Yes.
In that sense, democratic and answerable to the voters, right?
Perceive that to be the case. That's a fair characterisation.
A good framework or a good mechanism for something that you might want to be involved in the future?
Certainly. I'd love to be a part of any conversation I can to help shape reform and immediate issues.
I asked you about trust. Your term for the strategy that involved the aftermath of the shooting last time, it was cultural deceit. It's your term.
Yes, accept that term.
Yeah. You cannot build a future based on cultural deceit, can you?
Acknowledge there's a long way to go get back to the status quo, but acknowledged deceit is not a quality that is conducive to mutual respect and cultural. No.
I mean, I asked one of your colleagues this too, that on the night, even though there was Akbar Williams and other very senior members of the community outside that police station, actually wasn't one of those people there that you could trust even in the moment with the knowledge, even on a conditional basis that they don't share it, right?
That's, I don't know, and I mean this with the utmost respect, I don't think that's a fair question, but I'll answer it nonetheless. I trust Derek Williams explicitly, no doubt at all, but Senior ACPO Derek Williams is a man that I know is a powerful man in the community from a cultural perspective. I know he's a man that walks in two worlds, and I didn't want to put him, two reasons. One, I didn't want to put him in an uncomfortable position, and then secondly, and selfishly on my part, I didn't want to lose Derek Williams to cultural matters at the time. So I deeply regret any relationship breakdown I'll have with Derek Williams going forward, which inevitably there will be, because he's a man I respect very much. But I couldn't lose Derek on the night. As I expressed before, there was two factors at play here, deceit and Derek Williams, that changed the whole dynamics of the situation. So that doesn't mean I didn't trust Derek. It was a trust that had some complexities attached to it.
Without tangling too much on this, in the moment, you couldn't tell him what everybody wanted to know, right?
Correct, because of my fear of as to his cultural obligations as a strong cultural man.
And therefore, strong cultural imperatives needed to be weighed against, primarily, I suggest, safety of your members. What do you say about that?
Very narrow question. Safety of the community, not the safety of my members, inherent in which she is my members. But as I indicated in my evidence in chief, that I well and truly outweighed community safety over cultural sensitivities. And that's not something I'm happy about, but that's what I did at the time.
Superintendent, without questioning the fact that you weighed in the balance community safety issues, in those hours before sunrise, the immediate issues that were prominent, perhaps dominant, were the police and the police station, right?
No,
So
I can't accept that. It's
okay, could you explain, please, again perhaps, why did you want to evacuate the police station?
the prevailing risk, and I've explained the lived experience that I have that informed and influenced my organic and ongoing risk assessment at the time.
How was that a benefit to the community?
It was no benefit.
How was that going to save the community or provide safety to the community?
It was no benefit, and that's when common sense prevailed, and it didn't occur. Although we still had a plan in place that would bring about the evacuation if certain triggers occurred.
You were overruled, essentially, weren't you?
Yes, but through a consensus conversation. It didn't take much in terms of having a conversation with me and reshaping, not reshaping, but again, it was a consensus of conversation. Ultimately, yes, I was overruled, but it wasn't an arbitrary, you won't evacuate, and I was in dispute of that determination. It was the right determination made. That doesn't necessarily say, in my mind, that any plan or consideration prior to that or post that was wrong in terms of the potential for an evacuation and some contingency plans around what that might look like.
Mr. Knobs, I think everybody understands you will always stand by your decisions. That's a given.
No, it's not a given. I'm happy to.
You've made your position very plain over the course of hours. We've got that.
Yeah, but no, I'm happy to, if my decision's wrong, I'm happy to, I've got thick skin. If I make a wrong call, I'm happy to quite categorically sit here and say that was a wrong decision at a particular point in time, but not in relation to this.
Others before me have been put into aspects of your decision making were wrong, but you stand by what you decide.
In respect to this, yes.
So, Mr. Knobs, I'll come back briefly at the end to this, but I want to go back before the shooting. The fact that the health clinic staff decided that they were going to evacuate was also a decision which was of no benefit to the community and jeopardised their safety. Do you agree?
Agreed unequivocally, and I indicated when I was engaging the health staff that was an unacceptable risk that I did not support.
So, even in the face of your stated opposition, it still happened, right?
Correct, yes.
So, can you, doing the best you can with hindsight, how would it have been better to deal with that problem with that determined attitude by health staff at that time? What do you think could have been done?
It's a very broad question. I'm not quite sure if you could kind of narrow that.
So your reaction after they knocked you back on the suggestion they shouldn't pull out, your reaction was to engage with Sergeant Frost and to provide 4 members of the IRT to provide high-profile policing.
Correct, yes.
Okay. So is there, in hindsight, any different thing that you might have done to deal with this pull-out of health staff?
The pull-out of health staff was one of 5 matters that was loomed large in my decision-making at the time that brought about the deployment of extra resources. So, like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, other than a surge and respite deployment, what more could have been done. Perhaps I could have influenced more. Perhaps I could have not accepted the determination from the senior manager within Alice Springs and perhaps I could have taken that higher. I'm not sure, but that was a determination of the Department of Health.
Yeah. Well, it was the Department of Health.
Sorry.
Making a decision in less urgent circumstances would have been a good start. Do you agree? Like, let's have a chat about this before you tell your people to pull out.
And that's what I engaged Mrs. Helen Gill in relation to, and it was a... Sorry?
She wasn't interested in discussing it at that point.
No, we discussed it, but they maintained the determination that they were. It wasn't. It was I won't even say it was a robust consideration. It was a respectful dialogue and a fulsome dialogue. And
you got nowhere with it, did you?
Well, the stated position was the position that was maintained.
Yeah, and the suggestion that perhaps she might want to talk to your people and to local community leaders, that never came onto the radar, it seems. It's too late for that, or?
I'm not sure. I don't know if, and I honestly can't recall. I don't think we engaged in an element of what engagement have you and your staff had with the local community. No, I don't think that occurred.
Well, you assumed there hadn't been any, didn't you?
I don't know. I don't know if I did or didn't make that assumption at the time.
It certainly wasn't raised as a possibility in your discussions with Ms. Gill.
No, I don't know if I explicitly asked what local engagement have you had. It was a conversation. No.
Certainly, the withdrawal of the health staff put added pressure that you didn't really need on your police services, right?
The reasonable apprehension it would, yes. And that was one of Sergeant Frost's stated concerns.
After the shooting, you had some discussions with the chief pilot at the Royal Flying Doctor Service.
Mr. Damien Mills, yes.
Could you just tell us essentially what Mr. Mills's attitude was to flying in to help Kumanjayi Walker after he'd been shot by police?
I don't know if I could comment as to his attitude. I could comment in terms of the dialogue. So there was a number of telephone calls. So I deployed, off-duty, deployed into the police station, started establishing the IMT. Upon arrival, noted that the watch commander on duty was speaking to RFDS. I think I then subsequently called Mr. Mills back, recognised the whole multitude of things were going through my mind at this time, including but not limited to the necessity for us to send additional surge capability out there. I was aware that our police air wing wasn't deployable at that point in time.
What was that?
Sorry?
Why were they not deployable?
We had one asset in Alice Springs, and
he wasn't available.
He was on a night navigation statutory. Yep. So he was deployable, but there was going to be a lag. I wanted to get some resources, additional resources on the RFDS.
TRG.
No, I wanted. There was no TRG. I wanted whatever resources I could muster within Alice Springs to get out there.
Okay.
So it was an Alice Springs-based RFDS deployment. So I engaged Mr. Mills through that, explored the possibility of getting police on there. He said, in principle, I support that, although I'm going backwards and forwards with my chain of command in terms of whether we will or won't even deploy based on perceived risks. We talked about contingencies in terms of alternate locations to land, what that potentially might look like. And we continued in this sort of backwards and forwards dialogue until we got to the stage where, unfortunately, Kumanjayi Walker had passed away. And it was that time, and the air wing had come back online and wasn't far off being able to be deployed. So I then diverted the police resources from the RFDS hangar, which I had there in anticipation of a favourable determination, to the air wing for their subsequent deployment. But I got the impression that there was some reluctance within the command structure of RFDS based on perceived safety concerns, which I accepted in terms of deploying.
Did you tell Mr. Mills that you had this arrangement in place where nobody on the ground even knew that Kumanjayi was close to death, that you had this sort of arrangement, let's call it, and I'm not calling it any tricky name, but did you tell him about your strategy?
No, I don't think I told the ruse then, because the Kumanjayi Walker was alive at that time. So
do you think that the arrival of the Royal Flying Doctor Service would enhance the handling of the members of the Yuendumu community who are very concerned about Kumanjayi?
Certainly, but I was more optimistic around the deployment of the contingency nurses from the adjacent community in terms of provision of treatment.
If you had both, especially with the Royal Flying Doctor Service plane arriving, that would have been a really helpful mechanism, wouldn't it?
Certainly.
Even after he died, if you're continuing with the ruse, that would have been a very helpful mechanism.
No, I don't accept that. I don't accept the benefit in bringing in the RFDS plane as part of a ruse, given they're in short supply. I would hate to take away a capability from the broader community as part of a ruse, no.
The plane that did arrive was badged RFDS.
Correct, yes. Through a lease arrangement that we had.
I got it, but it wasn't part of your plan, but it did actually help the plan in the end.
Correct. I was aware of it at the time, and that was one of the considerations at the time. It was clearly a part of the calculated deception that that the plane was badged as a medical services plane.
Was it chosen because of that?
Well, it's not chosen. That was the only plane we have.
The only one?
Yes, correct.
Just want to check something. There has been a departure in the evidence between you and Mr. Worst about exactly what you said to him. It's clear, isn't it, that in your conversations with Mr. Worst, you weren't just asking for 4 people from Alice Springs to be deployed to Yuendumu. You wanted 4 people from Alice Springs who were IRT members to be deployed to Yuendumu. Do you agree with that?
I've got a clear recollection of my conversation with Mr. Worst to that end, yes.
And descended to details about what equipment they should take as IRT members, right?
Correct, yes.
You have a strongly expressed opinion that the IRT concept is worth backing in the future.
It's as a national best practice model, and in fact it's my contention that with the size of the TRG and the tyranny of distance that we presently have and where they presently are situated, that it's in fact dangerous that we don't have, well, dangerous is not the right term, but unsafe to not have a cadre that can deploy to a situation that has potential risk associated with it.
Yeah, so this IRT that we've been considering in this inquest, did you regard that as being properly trained?
I must admit, I didn't have an appreciation of their degree of training. I'm honest in saying that. They didn't fit within my command. I was strongly of the view that they were a highly trained, highly skilled, highly disciplined team. I had seen them training with TRG many times in the past, given my interactions around the police station, but I knew inherent within the concept that they had enhanced training, such as close quarters tactical training. It is my view, as is my understanding of all structures within the police services, that we have some of the best training in Australia, if not in the world.
So the coroner will receive quite a lot of evidence about these people's training.
Mm-hmm.
And the coroner's view will be informed by submissions, but not everybody shares your view about training. But you would certainly assume that if ever in the future there's to be anything like this, there would need to be comprehensive training and comprehensive selection criteria to ensure that people who are chosen are able to be properly trained. Do you agree?
Unequivocally, and just to be clear, I said I have no appreciation of their degree of training, so I haven't provided any evidence contrary to anyone. It's I don't know what their degree of training is.
So, Mr. Nobbs, you did on 10 or so occasions deploy the IRT, but you never had any particular command over the IRT members that you deployed. Do you accept that?
No, I did have command over the IRT because they were deployed in a general policing sense, so the command structure was within my command structure. So reportable to Sergeant Frost, who in turn is reportable to Senior Sergeant Potts, who's in turn reportable to me. So the general support, inherent within the general support deployment was a command structure that I was in charge of.
So the standard operating procedures, such as they were, required debriefing and report back to the superintendent in Alice Springs.
Correct, I may have misinterpreted your question. So no, I didn't have any day-to-day command of the IRT. They fell under the Alice Springs division. But if they were deployed as a capability operating within my patch, they were deployed under my command at that time.
For that operation?
Correct, yes.
But you're working very closely with the superintendent in charge of Alice Springs, work geographically close at least.
We're a team, yes.
What was your understanding of the level of supervision that the IRT had in the 2 or 3 years before Kumanjayi Walker was killed.
Again, if you talk about it as it's... Sorry, I'll start again. I can't answer that question definitively because they were a cadre workforce that formed up on an as-needs basis, which aligns with that sort of best practice methodology for some of these regional task force that operate in I won't say all jurisdictions, I think all jurisdictions, but certainly in most. I couldn't comment in terms of the supervision other than to say I'm quietly comfortable that the mechanisms that we have in place, whether it's the governance structures, the complaint management team structures, that there's checks into the use of force, auditing structures. There's a multitude of structures that underpin an assessment of people operating on a day-to-day basis.
Well, you're a member of the complaints management team in Alice Springs.
At the time, yes.
At the time. How often was there a meeting, for instance?
Fortnightly. So the composition of the complaints management team, the CMT, chaired by the commander for the command, so Bradley Curry. Participation within that is the professional standards command as well, and then each of the superintendents for their respective portfolio would sit in that meeting as well.
So did you hear about complaints regarding members of the IRT when you went to those fortnightly meetings?
I'll hear about complaints involving the whole police, the composition of the police station. So,
okay.
So short answer is yes,
Okay.
but not limited to them. Yes.
What was your role as a member of the CMT in considering the terms of the discussion about these complaints?
So my role is a prescribed member within my division. So my role, if you're looking at it within my portfolio, is to provide greater context in terms of where investigations sit, how an investigation might be progressing, any ultimate outcomes or preliminary assessments around remedial advice or actions that may or may not be required, checks and balances or mitigations we might put up in place, early intervention type activities. So that's within the construct of my division, and similarly the superintendent for Alice Springs would equally apply those same things for her division at the time.
Did you discuss officers in her division?
No, the CMT would discuss officers.
Well, you're on the CMT.
Yep.
Could you say, well, this fellow here, how come he's got 20 complaints in the last year or so? Did you ever have such a discussion?
No, I didn't have such a discussion, but that's
of anybody.
Look, I can't.
We've got more than just the odd complaint.
Yes, certainly.
Popping up on a sort of regular basis.
Yes, certainly.
What would be said or done about someone who is in that?
Well, again, it's a very, very broad question, but I guess the premise of the complaints management framework is that a complaint doesn't necessarily result in a finding of misconduct. It's a process that needs to be investigated. So, but it wouldn't be inconceivable that if we had a repeat participant within that environment, that we potentially might go, well, there's a few different matters here that all are leaning towards the same thing. What is it we potentially need to do preemptively whilst these matters are continuing to be investigated?
Was any such discussion had about Zachary Rolfe when you're on the CMT?
Again, I can't comment, only because it wasn't my area, so I'm not sure. The short answer is I'm not sure.
You're aware that he had a number of complaints against him when you were on the CMT, right?
Whether I was aware at the time, quite clearly I would have been aware, but I can't recall what dialogue may or may not have occurred specific to that member at that point in time. Clearly this process has demonstrated that there are a number of matters, but me articulating or reflecting back on particular things that were said relative to that member, I can't provide advice. But I'm as I indicated, the process was such that it's quite possible that there may have been conversations to that effect.
So had there been a conversation, not necessarily about Mr. Rolfe, but say a member with multiple complaints of excessive use of force in arrest, what type of action could be taken of the nature that you just discussed without a final determination of the complaint, or pending a final determination of the complaint?
Be a multitude of outcomes. So if we're
What sort of things happened?
generalising, so end to end, it could be from the start in terms of welfare conversations, through to remedial conversations, through to placement within an administrative position whilst matters are continued to be investigated. Could be a personal management plan, notwithstanding the disciplinary matters are still continuing, where we put some continuity in terms of supervision. There could be parameters put around that. There's a whole multitude of things that could be put in place as notwithstanding the investigation may not have reached its conclusion.
Did you see any of those mechanisms used with Mr. Rolfe?
Again, I can't comment specifically to Mr. That's a question for the superintendent for that area. I honestly can't recall.
Yeah, okay.
Did you see any of those mechanisms used for anyone?
I've used those mechanisms for people, Your Honour. That's inherent in the structure. It's not just about misconduct. Sometimes it's about welfare. It's just part and parcel of management.
What about in Alice Springs? Did you see anyone get the benefit of those types of mechanisms when you were on the CMT?
The things that I just outlined are things that would occur outside the CMT. It's not fair, or it's an answer I can't give. I don't know what was or wasn't done in respect by the superintendent in charge of that area to anyone that may have been presented on the CMT that would require an extra level of care and attention. That's a question for the superintendent. I simply can't answer it other than to say I would regularly engage in those end-to-end considerations if were warranted in the circumstances.
The IRT members might have been the direct responsibility of the superintendent in Alice Springs, but there are people you deployed as part of your operations and you needed to be sure that they were safe, right? And fit for purpose.
I assume, as a proud Northern Territory police officer, that we have the best training in Australia, if not in the world, that all my police officers that are being deployed are sufficiently disciplined, are sufficiently trained to undertake the roles that they put in place to deliver. That's an assumption I make across all of it. I don't have an appreciation of the nuances of the training associated to negotiators. I don't have an appreciation of the nuances of the training associated to dog unit, TRG, intelligence units, all those units, but I assume that they are highly trained police officers, given what I contend is being the most, that's my view.
When you were on the CMT, was there discussion about problems with particular officers regularly turning off their body-worn video cameras?
I don't know if if the conversations were so pointed to a deliberate action or a perception of a deliberate action that they're turning it off, certainly multiple conversations about the challenges not being on. Correct, yes. And
so what never got to the point where someone would say, well, I wonder if he's turned it off. It was all about it's not on, as opposed to why is it so, and perhaps he's turning it off.
Again, if it was me and in terms of my portfolio responsibility, and as I've indicated to my police officers, if I have repeat instances where, so it's not a question of whether it was deliberately turned on or not turned on, or the fact remains, we generally have a complaint and we generally don't have body-worn evidence in support of that. That's generally then raised as one of the ancillary issues inherent within the complaint. If I have cases where I have multiple instances of non-compliance with the policy framework around body-worn video, I then indicate to the police officers that are the subject of those repeat instances that the next investigation that I undertake will be a more serious investigation, so a category 2.
Why isn't it on?
Correct, but in most cases the conversation is, why isn't it on? In most cases it's new technologies, or in the situation that we're responding to, I simply forgot, or things such as that, to that effect.
Okay. Superintendent, last time you gave evidence, you were asked about the racist terms of some text messages that were put in front of you.
Correct, yes.
And you were asked whether you'd heard such terms in the general community in Alice Springs, and you said that you had. You said, I've seen it sort of deteriorate over the years. It has a relatively intolerant community. Were you talking about Alice Springs being a relatively intolerant community?
Yeah, again, as a generalisation, it's probably not fair to whole community in totality as being an intolerant community, but certainly over my 24 years connection to this community, a community I consider my home, notwithstanding I live in Nhulunbuy now, but I've spent more time in my life in Alice Springs than I have anywhere else. Community that I love, and yeah, I've seen the deterioration of attitudes over the years. Correct, yes.
You're asked, but do you say in the police station you've never heard or seen or heard that language? And you said, no, you couldn't say that. I want to ask you to just tell us, frankly, about the use of racist language, to start with, in the police station at Alice Springs and amongst police officers in Alice Springs.
I think what I said, or certainly what I implied, was that given my rank, I don't see it on a day-to-day basis, but I think it would be naive and disingenuous for me to say that it's potentially not there, given the deep dive we've had on a few matters here. As
Superintendent, you're there. You're of that rank for a reason.
Correct, yes.
You've got police officers' instincts and a lifetime of experience. Could you please tell us frankly, are there people in Alice Springs who are not ashamed amongst their colleagues to talk filthy talk about Aboriginal people?
Again, I am there, but I don't operate within the confines of the muster room. I'm, whether that's rightly or wrongly, confined to a office burdened by the computer on a day-to-day basis. I don't see the racism or racist comments on a day-to-day basis. But again, as I said, and I'm trying to be as honest as I can, I think it'd be naive for me to say that there aren't some. As indicated, we're a microcosm of society.
Sorry, go on.
I'd ask my little friend not to speak over the witnesses.
I apologise to him.
Thank you.
We're a microcosm of society. The police service is that. So again, all I could say as honestly as I can is that I think I'd be naive to say that there's not some people that hold inappropriate and racist views, but I don't know how I could be more honest than that.
So, racism, of course, as you would understand, can take many forms, not just words, but attitudes and actions, or
Correct.
inactions.
Correct? Consciously or subconsciously, yes.
It can be a system that disregards people because of race and treats them differently accordingly. Do you understand that?
Agreed, yes.
Okay. Has it ever occurred to you that some of your colleagues' excessive use of force might be driven by a lack of human empathy with the people they're arresting?
As a general or broad proposition, I accept that could be a reasonable determination, but again, that's a generalisation. It's not specific to anything, but I accept the nexus, the potential nexus there, yes.
The potential nexus is very real when nearly 100% of the people that get arrested are Aboriginal people, right? Do you accept that?
The potential nexus, yes, is real.
And has anyone, yourself included, in the last 2 or 3 years, specifically considered whether inappropriate use of force by police officers under your command and operating here in this township might be connected with a lack of human empathy for Aboriginal people?
I've got no doubt that every single complaint and every single investigation, there would be due consideration to whether this is or isn't racially motivated, whether there is or isn't any racial undertones. There's no doubt that is a standard consideration in respect to any investigation, given the disparity as you've outlined in terms of Indigenous offending rates.
But it's a very difficult topic to deal with, isn't it?
If the contention is that there is widespread racism permeating the culture of the police service, certainly would be
to label any individual as a racist is a very significant conclusion to make. And every decision about use of force, impropriety in policing in any way, would need to think 2, 3 and 4 times before you jump to that conclusion.
Certainly, if you're going to take the extraordinary step to call someone a racist, you better make sure that you've got an evidence base to support such an assertion. So, yes.
So, Mr. Nobbs, wherever this topic is considered, the racists get the benefit of the doubt. What do you say to that?
No,
Unless you got them cold on in a text message, or you got them on a video saying something about Aboriginal people that's obviously racist.
Well, look, I think, and again, it's probably not a fair question in the context of this in isolation, but I think the principles of natural justice and all the legal maxims talk about the benefit of the doubt generally goes to the accused. I don't think that's limited to racism.
What about the system? How do you judge the system? Do you give the system the benefit of the doubt?
Please explain the question.
So if your individual is accused, that person gets all the trappings of natural justice. But if the system looks and acts and sounds like a system that acts in one way towards Aboriginal people and in a different way to white people, how do you judge the system?
Oh, the system, as a broad construct, is an imperfect beast, I acknowledge, but the system and the continuous improvement and the evolution of reform within the system is what we all continue to inspire to achieve. But it's imperfect. There's always opportunity for reform and tweaking around the edges, but I'm not sure. It's a pretty abstract discussion. I'm not quite sure if I'm adequately answering your question, but
single individual doing a very good job. Can I say this, Mr. Nobbs? No one would suggest for a minute that you hold any racist views whatsoever, except you would acknowledge that what happened under your command in the hours after Zach Rolfe shot Kumanjayi Walker acted in a way which was actually discriminatory towards Warlpiri people because you couldn't trust the Warlpiri people because of their practices, their cultural practices, right?
yeah, and I think I said my evidence in chief. I really struggle with the dichotomy, the inherent conflict between our system and that system, but I acknowledge as a byproduct of that disparity that that the Warlpiri people were were disadvantaged in the context of their cultural and acknowledge the extreme importance of culture within the context of the Warlpiri people and Indigenous communities more broadly. But the system, as you abstractly outline, is brought about a conflict there, and that's hopefully what this process will bring about, some meaningful reform, not just for the police service, but equally for the Warlpiri community as well, in terms of how we overcome some of those insidious, well, not insidious, but very, very complex challenges.
It's always the last thing.
England is going to be quite brief. I'm happy for you to start. And we can keep going and see if we finish you before the lunch break. We'll have a bit longer.
Well, I hope to finish before the lunch break, that's for sure.
Sure.
Just on that last point, you mentioned the dichotomy between, Superintendent McMahon and I for the current group committee of the Move,
Good afternoon.
which is the Justice Committee. I'm not asking you to solve this dilemma, and you've identified it as a dilemma, the conflict between what you saw as the need to employ a ruse on the community on the night and balance that against all the factors. And our focus here is looking forward, actually, ultimately looking forward to solving problems in the future and avoiding similar problems. But you'd accept with me that the reality is that whether or not the police took the right view about employing a ruse, and opinions obviously differ on that, one of the predictable consequences we now know is that there's a long-term and significant breakdown in trust between the police and the community. Do you accept that?
Acknowledge, yes.
And by employing an ambulance in the way that was employed as part of that ruse, it actually introduces a potential long-term breakdown in trust of ambulances and their employment in high-risk and dangerous environments, such as some of the examples you gave earlier today.
Yes, certainly, and the use of the ambulance in the ruse was a regrettable decision on my part.
I'm not seeking to attribute blame to you. We just want to highlight the fact that you recognise those realities.
Regrettable for the reasons that you've outlined, yes, and such the acknowledgement.
In particular, even as you do maintain the position, and I'm not passing any judgment on that at the moment, but as you maintain the position that it was a necessary step for you to take to employ a ruse as between the police and the community, you would agree that employing the ambulance as part of that ruse, in retrospect, was an extra and unnecessary step.
Correct, yes. The ruse could have still been facilitated without the use of the ambulance. Well, sorry, no. the use of the ambulance was still appropriate, potentially, although I acknowledge the fallout in terms of what you've indicated, the potential eroding of trust of the ambulance, but certainly the utilisation of the health workers within the ambulance was an unnecessary part of the plan.
How would it have been operated without the health workers given a limited number of members in the station?
Well, Your Honour, I still maintain we could have had a police officer drive that vehicle in isolation. It's a vehicle. It was. Seven police officers in the police station at the time, 3 vehicles used in the ruse.
Can I suggest that isolating the question of the appropriate use of a police ruse or not, and as you know, opinions will differ on that. Can I suggest that one of the learning experiences going forward is that it would never be appropriate to engage the health services or ambulances or medical clinics or doctors or nurses in any such ruse, even if the police formed a view in the future after learning from this experience that a ruse was necessary in some other event. Can you accept that?
On the balance, I could accept that, yes.
One thing you said a couple of times in answer to questions to my learned friends about what's his name? Mr. Bolton, SC, Forbes Chambers, formerly president of the New South Wales Bar Association, etc. You said a couple of times that you make the assumption that the IRT and all officers, but you seem to be focusing a bit on the IRT, were very highly trained and trained as well as anyone, perhaps anyone in the world.
Correct, yes.
That's a nice idea to have, but it's not at all obvious from the evidence in this case that the IRT were particularly well trained or had a great understanding of their role at various points of an operation. So I just want to ask you, with regard to your assumption about well trained, are you saying that it's your hope and wish that the people like the IRT and Northern Territory Police are well trained, or it's the fact that are you actually saying that based on your learning and observation and experience compared to other police forces elsewhere in Australia and the world, that they are in fact better trained than most, if not almost all?
Look, my view is that it's more than a mere hope. It is an expectation. We have some of the most challenging one of the most challenging operational environments by far, certainly in Australia. Can't comment beyond that. The volume of matters in which we deal with. As a broad proposition, self-serving as it may be, is my contention that the Northern Territory Police are held in high regard as in respect to their decision-making, their problem-solving, their engagement frameworks, their capacity to deal and de-escalate situations given the persistent, pervasive and prodigious nature of the matters in which we deal with.
All right, so that's talking about the Northern Territory Police as a whole. No, I'm just isolating IRT. You're not including IRT training.
I guess I am. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say is that inherent within that is any of our discrete units, divisions, sections, capabilities. My more than a mere hope, my expectation or true belief and understanding is that the training and the experience that we gain on a day-to-day basis is a product of is high. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Well, maybe a bit, but that's usually my fault, not yours. The point I'm trying to make is when we see what the IRT have done in this case, one of the things that does not jump off the page at you is that they're highly trained and highly skilled. Right? Now, contrast that with what we've seen in this court on the TRG. We've had evidence from the TRG, which I'm sure most people have called compelling in terms of excellence of training and so on. But the IT have 1 week of bushcraft skills, 1 week of black skills in a house, clearing a house or clearing rooms as their 2-week course. Then they have 1 day every 5 weeks. So it's actually a very modest amount of training if you're calling them an elite unit, which is an implication of the way you talk about it. Do you accept that?
Look, I accept that you're telling me that's the extent of their training. I don't know what the extent of their training is. I wasn't there when they were developed. I wasn't there when they were recruited. I wasn't there in any of those aspects.
Well, that is the answer to the question, is because your hope that they're very well trained is not based on a specific knowledge of how they're trained. Is that correct?
Again, I don't use the term hope, and I'll be clear that that's not my position. It's an expectation, and a reasonable expectation, that they receive that level of training. You've talked about, if I could finish, you talk about the professionalism and highly developed skill set of the TRG. As I indicated before, what I had cause to see through my management within Alice Springs was TRG working hand in hand with IRT, not only in the field on occasions, but also within the training environment. So the reasonable expectation that TRG would influence, and there would be parallels in terms of the methodologies and training and skill set that would come from that, is, I would say, more than a mere hope, but an expectation.
All right, well, we'll just leave that. When Ms. Moreau was asking these questions, you gave evidence about the crime rates in the Northern Territory.
Yes.
On a per capita basis, and how severe they were. You went over a number of incidents over about a 12-year period, 2010, 14, 2018, and so on.
Yes.
And you spoke about your concerns of sometimes seeing things quickly deteriorate.
Yes.
And you also mentioned that in the scheme of all of that, Unimu also had high data, or higher data in some areas for crime and so on. Now, just to put that in the context of the questions I'm about to ask you about the various committees that you've referred to. You've been a policeman, I think, for 25 years.
24, 25 years, yes.
And at least 18 have been in this part of the world, in the southern part of the Northern Territory.
Correct, yes.
And as I understood what you've said to various council, your impression, based on what you've observed and also what you've learned through data and so on, is that things have just steadily been getting worse during your career in terms of the level of crime, the nature of crime, and the pervasiveness of crime.
Yeah, we maintain on a secular basis a long-term upward trend in crime and dysfunction. There's cyclicalities, I acknowledge, but as a broad proposition, an upward trend over the 24 years that I've been associated with the police service.
And you're obviously very reflective in the work that you do. So you'd agree with you that if that's the reality that you're confronting at a senior level as a commander, I don't mean rank, but as someone who commands and develops policy and implements policy by commanding officers, if that's the reality over all the changes that have occurred in your time, then you'd accept, wouldn't you, that it invites the need for very serious consideration of radically changed approaches and creative responses to those problems.
100%. I'm open to try anything.
I just want to consolidate for a couple of minutes this question of committees that you've been asked about over different parts of your evidence. And I want to take you to 4 of them so we can just have a clear picture in our minds the difference. You've got the Unimu Community Safety Committee framework.
Sorry, yes, at the time that's no longer a framework, yes.
it's called the Unity Community Safety Committee, right?
Correct, yep.
You actually started that, didn't you?
Correct, yes.
About in 2018. Is that
Correct,
right?
March of that year, yes.
March 18, and it involves.
Sorry, March 18 or 19?
It doesn't matter for these purposes.
Okay, sorry.
Because I'm leading ultimately to this question of the best way to interact with the community, and your observations when you were here last about the proliferation of agency meetings, the proliferation of meetings, the duplication and so on. So,
Can I just ask though, when did it finish?
It lasted for about 6 months. We resolved, well, I won't say completely resolved, but had a substantial abatement in property crime, and then reverted back to the standard community safety action plan framework and the integration within that framework, Your Honour. Give or take 6 months, Your Honour.
can you place that in the context of the 9 November 2019 killing of Kumanjayi Walker? That's 6 months. Because March of that year would take you up to just before the shooting. Is that the year that this happened?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure of it.
All right, that's all right. That's no longer exists. Is that right?
Correct, yes. It was. It served a purpose. It was about a higher degree of governance and mutual accountability, and me, I guess, attempting to drive the narrative and bring about mutual accountability across the services providers and community to address a specific issue and the things that were periphery to that specific issue.
And the specific issue that we were seeing versus property.
Correct. And more to the point, predominantly youth-related property crime. So I had a leaning towards youth.
Criticising you for instigating a new proposal like that. That's exactly the sort of thing we mentioned a moment ago. But I just want to make 2 observations and see if you agree with them. Firstly, is that it was driven by you as someone not living in the community, obviously.
Correct, yes.
And secondly, what you said last time is that it wasn't well attended by the elders.
Correct, yes.
It's not a criticism, because I'd be the first to applaud a genuine creative effort to solve problems that you've identified, but that was the upshot of it, correct?
Yes.
You've spoken about the Community Safety Action Plan, which is the CSAP, I think it's sometimes known, is that right?
CSAP, yes.
And that involves, once again, trying to deal with matters like domestic violence and social problems, correct?
Less domestic violence, but certainly domestic violence from a broad construct, but not probably specific aspect. More amenity, social order, broader sort of environmental issues. So community safety.
And if I understood your evidence last time, although it was meant to engage the elders, your sense was that the community leaders were not great at attending those meetings?
Yeah, yes. Again, well, I'm just trying to reflect it. It's as a broad proposition, that's the case. But as I said in my evidence last time, I've tried to challenge the status quo in terms of the way we think about community safety action plan, insofar as that it's a meeting that we have at 2 o'clock at the basketball court, and if you're not there by 2:10, we will cancel it and move on. But to change our way of engaging clan groups as part of the broader CSAP framework
We've all got that evidence. So I'm not trying to cut you off and just being time efficient. And your strategy for talking to your officers was to say, be creative about how you don't see it as a once a month or once a fortnight meeting. Be creative about how you engage with the community on this issue.
Correct, yes.
Maybe talk to individuals, maybe talk to groups. However it works. Even go and play footy all day if it works.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. The CSAP, or Community Safety Action Plan, still operates. And do you attend those meetings?
No.
And do you know how often it meets?
It's supposed to meet monthly.
But when you say supposed to, that invites the thought that perhaps it doesn't.
Agreed, for the reasons I just outlined, that it may not occur through cultural reasons, it may not occur for lack of attendance, it may not occur, but through our sort of policy framework is that it's supposed to meet monthly.
the next framework which you identified last time was the family safety framework, which, as I understood, is essentially not involving the local members of the community, but involving rather those agencies with statutory obligations.
Correct, yes.
And so there's no buy-in at all from community elders or community members.
No, we
I'm
talk.
not criticising, I'm just setting out the framework. That's
Agreed. There's really deep personal conversations within that framework.
And it's one reason that there are not individual members of the community present as elders or emerging elders is because at that meeting there are agencies swapping information in a way which can be appropriately done between government agencies, but not with individuals who don't have certain obligations of privacy and so on imposed upon them.
Correct.
Okay. And then the next one that you spoke about was the local authority meetings, which Mr. Bolton asked you about.
Yes.
And you understood that probably to come from the Central Desert Regional Council.
In the case of Yunamu, yes, but it's across the territory.
Yeah, so it might emerge in different ways in different parts of the territory.
Fundamentally, they're the same, led by local government, shires, or the like.
Yeah. And you're not invited to that.
No.
But you thought that one worked reasonably well. That those meetings worked reasonably well in terms of local community buy-in, partly because there was people were remunerated for being involved in those meetings.
It's a sort of a broad observation. I don't know what occurs within the meetings because I'm not invited, but when I am invited and I'm engaged from a community safety perspective, the dialogue is robust, considered, constructive, and the participants are engaged, and then I leave.
And has buy-in from the local community.
Correct, yes.
In terms of attendance and participation from elders and emerging elders.
Again, as a broad proposition, yes.
Yes. And
I must admit, I don't think I was ever invited to Yunamu local authority. I've been to many others.
So to summarise, looking at those groups that those meetings or frameworks that we've just identified, it's not a criticism, it's just trying to analyse and understand and build for the future. Follow?
Yes.
In each case, the framework or a committee which is set up from the outside,
yes,
and brought into the community in the wish that the community would buy in and all parties would mutually benefit.
Correct. There are others as well that we haven't touched on, but one of the factors in building those frameworks is a degree of community consultation. But again, that notwithstanding doesn't translate to, as a broad proposition, community participation. Some communities, there's really good community participation, but certainly wouldn't appear to be the case there.
And as you appreciate, I'm just acting here for people from Yunamu, and that's what
yes.
we're focusing on. And to summarise your analysis of the proliferation or the coexistence of all of those committees and frameworks and so on, you said last time that you felt that there was an over-proliferation of such committees and frameworks, and that the effect of that was that there were too many meetings overlapping and too much replication with the same intention. Do you agree with all of that?
Agreed.
And overall, far too little buy-in from the community.
Agreed. And then further, an inability for the framework to mature because it's then promptly replaced with another framework.
As one after another fails or doesn't do a good enough job.
Correct, yes.
And implicit in all of what you're saying, which is why I'm asking you these questions, because of the reflection that you've obviously had on this issue over many years, is that you implicitly recognise the value of local community buy-in to any of these frameworks and how important it is. That just goes without saying, really, doesn't it?
It's critical and essential.
And again, built within that idea, you accept very clearly in your mind that as part of that, there must be local decision making, decisions about all of these issues which cover such a wide range, not just law and order, which your main focus in, but other issues which you are interested in but have no power over, such as housing problems. You're interested in those matters even though you have no power over them, correct?
Correct, they're all intrinsically linked, yes.
Because you previously identified environmental factors such as overcrowding in housing is linked to the law and order problem, which is your obviously mandate. In fact, if I understood what you previously said, you quite readily link housing problems with law and order problems.
I don't think I said that, but I acknowledge.
No, you didn't say that.
I agree, yes. Short answer, yes.
Extracting an idea from various things you've said.
As one of many factors, yes.
Because where there's overcrowding, it might be, where there's overcrowding, it's much more likely that there'll be a whole variety of reasons why younger children might be wandering around at night unsupervised and things like that.
Agreed, yes.
And in terms of environmental factors, which is a word that you used when you were getting questioned by Dr. Dwyer, in terms of housing, that would include things like low quality housing, housing without air conditioning, and those houses nevertheless being overcrowded, all creating a mosaic of problems.
Agreed.
Not for you to solve.
And I don't.
A few questions you've been asked today, not for you to solve, but what you bring is personal observation over many years and participation.
Correct, yes.
So in terms of thinking about this for the future and the recommendations you'll be making to Honour, and looking at creative ways forward, if not solutions, would you agree that there's real value in considering a local authority of Yuendamu elders and emerging elders as a central organisational body, so an elected group of leaders and emerging leaders who are elected from the whole of the community, north, south side, west side and so on, who are appropriately remunerated so that it's reasonable to expect them to invest huge amounts of personal time in these issues. Would you agree that if there was such a central elected leadership group, that you can see that that could well work to deal with all the agencies that we've spoken about today, as being a voice for the community, as being a group to whom someone such as yourself or your delegates could come and speak about the kinds of issues you've been spoken or questioned about by all council here?
Oh, 100%. Local decision making is central to everything we do, and if we don't have local decision making, we're just well intended but flapping in the breeze, basically.
And you can see how rather than having a few elders turn up to one meeting sometimes and other elders turning up to another meeting on other times, would you agree that if there was a local leadership authority elected from within the community, that would be potentially an excellent way to solve some of the problems you've identified about how previous efforts have failed?
Yes.
Just have two other points for you. One of the issues of real concern to my client is a failure of some witnesses, and I say this with respect to all of your efforts, you're probably one of them, to appropriately use words which are important to them, and payback is the word I'm going to talk about now. And I don't intend to be critical of you here, but would you accept that what's happened today in this court when talking about payback is we're actually merging two different ideas, and you understand both those ideas, but we're using the same word for two different ideas. One of them is something which you understand and spoke about, which is traditional law, and how payback, which is the word used in English for traditional law, But in Walker, obviously it's going to be Walker words. And I don't pretend for a moment that I'm the suitable person to discuss this with you, but it's on the agenda. It's been spoken about today, so I'm just going to raise it with you. From what you said, you understand payback in terms of traditional culture to be quite a sophisticated concept. You agree with that?
As a concept, yes.
In traditional customary law?
Yes.
It involves people, after some offence is done, meeting, consulting, negotiating, and agreeing on what ought to be done as a result of the earlier offence or infringement. You agree with that?
Yeah. About maintaining discipline, finalisation of matters, it's bringing about peace and harmony, acknowledge all those aspects, yes?
That's right. And if, as a result of that coming together and discussing all of that, there's acceptance of a solution, and then the offender accepts that and then justice is done, then that's, if you like, a very simplistic but satisfactory explanation for these purposes of what payback means when it's translated into English.
When undertaken through those parameters, yes.
And then you spoke about another kind of event which involves the anger and the alcohol-fueled examples you spoke about. And can I suggest to you that it would be better to use an alternative word to payback, because once we start using the word payback in that context, we're really talking about anger and fighting and rage and revenge and those sorts of concepts, which are quite different and distinct from what you just spoke about a moment ago, is our understanding of traditional customary law when it comes to payback.
Conceptually, yes, I understand that and agree wholeheartedly. My reference to the term is an echo of the reference applied by Indigenous people to the term, specifically payback, as a catch-all for a whole lot of violent disorders. And as I indicated before, I could count on my hand the amount of times I've seen it powerfully regulate through structure, governance, and it's quite powerful to watch. But I'm trying to answer the question, but I've seen, and it's the term used by the individuals, it's not my term, I'm merely applying it to the term used by the individuals.
So in terms of going forward from here, you'd agree that it would benefit all of us when we're talking about these concepts in Aboriginal communities to bear in mind the difference between, on the one hand, what you spoke about as traditional customary law, where the word payback is used, and the other events which, bearing in mind what I just said, payback is not really going to be suitable.
I agree, that's not payback.
All right, thank you very much. Oh, no, sorry, I have one other question. I'm picking up your honours issue.
But the difficulty is when there is an excuse or explanation proffered by the person using the violence or force or taking the action and labelling it as payback to try and legitimise or excuse their behaviour. So it's very difficult for, I think, police to try and put a different label on that when it's being presented to them by the person engaging in the conduct as a form of payback.
And particularly in the context, Your Honour, that person is an Indigenous person. I have a very good, practical, lived understanding of payback, but I certainly don't purport to be an expert. So if an Indigenous person uses that term, I acknowledge there's a multitude of complexities and nuance within that term, but that's the determination I then reach.
And it would certainly be a term that judges in the Northern Territory would be familiar with being used regularly in their courts to describe the behaviour that is being considered.
I appreciate the point both Your Honour made and the witnesses made, and also endeavouring here to bring to light the concerns that our client has about the way that all of us sometimes use this word and trying to move forward, trying to get a better clarity around that. My last point is picking up Her Honour's point from earlier today in terms of negotiators. I'm not now asking only about the value of having a negotiator at unanimity on the 9th going into the 10th and, of November 2019. But just conceptually, can you consider this for us? When you were asked earlier in the day on the 9th of November to authorise the deployment of some personnel, and I'm not interested in whether anyone said it should or shouldn't be IRT. Let's just assume for a moment someone says, I need the IRT, we've got a problem at a particular place. Now, two other things that immediately come into mind for you are the use of a dog, with a dog and a trainer, or probably not called a trainer, a handler.
Handler, yes.
And the use of a drone.
Yes.
Correct? Now, so in an ideal world, well-resourced and so on, when you deploy the IRT to what is presumably regularly a relatively unknown situation with many variables and the potential for many different outcomes, or perhaps not many different outcomes, but radically different outcomes, the potential for radically different outcomes. Is there any reason why conceptually, you can't build into that deployment as a matter of course and as a standard step, the inclusion of a negotiator, so that every time the RT is deployed, except when you've got, for instance, some bloke running down the street shooting randomly, which the negotiator is not going to be much use there, but for many of the deployments, why not just build in to the way that a unit such as the IRT, if there's a future manifestation of it, the engagement of not just the well-trained, extra-trained police and perhaps a dog, although we'll be making submission of that, I'm not going to bother with that now, drones, which give you eyes from the sky. Why not just, as a matter of course, conceptually introduce a negotiator as part of every deployment, except where it would be obviously futile to do so?
Doctrinally, you would. But again, in the context of this matter, I considered it a routine response.
I'm not talking about the context of this matter, we're talking about moving forward.
I agree, but I guess what I'm just trying to finish by saying, the negotiating element for me in this matter was Constable ALFEO was the person that was to facilitate that function at the 5 a.m. arrest plan for a routine matter. I don't think you could constrain all routine matters with the needs to have a negotiator deployed, but certainly I acknowledge that there was an opportunity here, given there's a lag in time, that potentially could have been some consideration to it.
So just perhaps to turn that a bit, I don't want to get bogged down in the details of this case, about which we know more than most people ever know about any case of entry, but as a way of moving forward, as a way of deciding to deploy a unit such as an elite unit, whatever they're called, TRGIs, you agreed with conceptually that whether or not a negotiator is actually sent, it should initially be part of the immediate response in terms of considering what assets to deploy.
I don't know if we get to the stage of arbitrarily saying that you will and you must, but certainly acknowledge that the utility value of a negotiator in the context of the scenario that you just outlined is very beneficial and should be, the default should be to consideration for utilisation, not consideration for not utilisation, if that makes sense.
And perhaps the final question on that, although I think the next witness is more suited, the next witness is Superintendent Vickery, I think. Is it Vickery?
Yes.
A name like that. Whatever value command of Northern Territory Police and government of Northern Territory placed on the IRT, whatever value they said they placed on that, it's the case, isn't it, that the entire budget of the IRT was simply part of the operating budget of Alice Springs Police Station and had no separate budget for acquisition of any particular things that they needed or training they needed done.
Not sure if I knew that at the time, and in fact I'm not sure if I even know that to be the case now.
I'm not saying it is the case, it's just something that material I've been reading has led me to think that. Though I may be wrong, but do you don't know the answer to that?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Do you agree that it's, well, from what I've been reading, it seems that at the very least the IT was financially very constrained and very under-resourced.
Agree.
And in order to operate an elite unit required to perform extraordinarily hard tasks with a great deal of training in excellence and precision and so on, if people are going to make a decision that such a unit is needed, then they need to make a decision to budget accordingly so that it's well financed, so that it can do its job properly.
It's an obvious statement which I support.
Yeah.
All stand, and we'll ask them temporarily adjourned.
Fine.